is a multidisciplinary scholar in the African Studies at university, which she will pronounce when she starts speaking, in the Czech Republic, and an honorary affiliate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Her research focuses primarily on the sociocultural politics of language, race, ethnicity, and gender. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Rudwick. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Sinfri, for allowing me the opportunity to introduce my book and to speak in this forum. I feel very privileged, having been one of the first initially attendees of this forum when we started, I guess, just a little under 2 years, right? During the COVID period, I was still in South Africa at the time. So it's really also, it's wonderful to see what it has become now, and the breadth of the forum, how much globally represented and how many acknowledged amazing scholars you've already have managed to draw into this forum, thinking of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and many others. Yeah. So yes, I want to introduce the book that I spent, well, nearly 5 years writing. The plan was to, I had to extend my contract with Routledge twice. They had to be very patient, but finally now it's out. It came out last year towards the end. So what I've done basically in this book is, I think I would call it like a humble attempt, say, to make sense of the politics of language and race in South Africa, and that in the context of English as a lingua franca. So what I want to do is maybe take you through the book, highlight particular chapters, just also read a couple of, specifically one vignette to you in order to illustrate a little bit more tangible, precisely what the chapters are dealing with. And yeah, most of all, I'm just hoping to bite your brains at the end of the session. So I'm going to try to not speak longer than maybe a good half an hour, 40 minutes. Chanel, you're also welcome to maybe send me a sign if you feel like I'm babbling along, and it could be just as well, I could just as well wind up. Good. So yeah, the book, I think in all, is, I have to say, extremely undisciplined, let's say, and eclectic. Although it's published with the Linguistic Anthropology series of Routledge, it's just as much sociology, it's just as much political science, I'd say. It's the result of altogether basically 14 years of on and off ethnography in South Africa. I actually, ironically, only started more specifically working on this particular project and working on the role of English as a lingua franca after I left South Africa, well, obviously not for good, but for having a primary residence, let's say, in Central Europe. I lived in South Africa from 2001 to 2008, and I draw from some of the field work that already took place during the ethnography for my PhD, but it's primarily really the data that I collected more systematically between 2009 and 2019. And I was able to write up this book, and I'd like to actually acknowledge the institute, the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies, STEAS, where I got caught during the COVID pandemic in the beginning of 2020 I was able to stay until June and managed to write up large parts of this book during the period. I'd also like to acknowledge specifically 3 individuals who've been my long-time consultants over a really extended period. So I would like to specifically thank in this context Matrino Shange, Lauren Williams, and Mobile Buthelezi, who've really been my loyal, given me loyal company for, let's say, altogether 10 years. And I also would like to actually put a disclaimer first. So while this book is primarily written about English, but English as embedded in multilingualism, as spoken among people who don't have it primarily as a first language. But I would like to emphasize that this book by no means argues that English is the only lingua franca in South Africa, or even the primary lingua franca in South Africa. In fact, nationally representative data suggests that isiZulu is spoken to a larger degree than English. I, in fact, also acknowledge in this book in several parts that English often fails as a useful lingua franca. So that means also that the entire monograph, in some sense, can only do, let's say, restricted, limited justice to the politics of language and race in South Africa, even though it also in many ways speaks to the vitality of other languages, especially isiZulu and Afrikaans and Kaaps in South Africa. I added to the readings for the session, I also added the publication that we wrote with Irina Turner in Bayreuth and Sameka Sijadu from Stellenbosch University about the multilingual code switching of politicians during the COVID crisis in South Africa, in order to also demonstrate this very fact that I just mentioned, that English often fails as a useful lingua franca. So perhaps to start the best is to, for those of us who are not applied or social linguists, and I know this forum is fundamentally interdisciplinary. So I'd like to start with maybe giving a little bit of background to the general research field of English as a lingua franca, which is primarily located in applied linguistics. And much of this literature is, let's say, capitalizing very much on this paradigm that English is a relatively neutral lingua franca. It is, what is often highlighted is this highly communicative value of the language. And I think it is, having been familiar with this literature, I've always taken issue with the slightly romanticized, perhaps, ideas about what English as a lingua franca does. And so one of the primary, let's say, impetus for me to write this book is to find a way to Southernize, to kind of move the center of the studies for English lingua franca away from the European context, because that has been essentially the geopolitical gravity of the field, with to some extent also Asia, but only really the more developed countries in Asia as well. So to move it out of this context and bring to the African world and life worlds. The book consists altogether of 10 chapters, starts with this contextualizing of English and the so-called L field. So the acronym ELF is commonly used. In the chapter right after the introduction, the third chapter gives a bit of socio-historical background to the story of English, obviously as the story of colonialism in South Africa. And then I'd like to focus in this talk as well, because that's the reading that I provided, that I extracted from the book, the chapter 4, which focuses primarily on marginalization and empowerment. Then there's other chapters in which I'm sometimes juxtaposing binaries, only then in the end to kind of deconstruct those binaries and in order to try to advance and push the field further and move away from these kind of, let's say, very polarizing analysis. So yes, to provide now a little bit more detail. So what the field of ELF basically comprises is, let's say, a sub-branch of the broad field of world Englishes, which I think most of you will be familiar with. Only with the difference that ELF scholars have moved let's say, the focus of attention from geographical region, from place to context. So what ELF scholars have been focusing on is this distinction, or rather they've been working on blurring the let's say, the significance of the distinction between the native and the non-native speaker of English. What I really like about the field is that there's an extraordinary high number of representation of women. So those who are called let's say, the three mothers of ELF, in fact, they have been called. These are Jennifer Jenkins in the UK, ironically, in England. Then there's Barbara Seidelhofer in Vienna, Austria. And then there's Anna Moranen in Finland, who have, in a way, simultaneously or roughly around the time in the early 2000s, published each of them seminal works. Jennifer Jenkins, for instance, focusing more on phonology, and Anna Moranen focusing specifically on kind of Finnish context of English lingua franca speakers. Barbara Seidelhofer more on lexico-grammatical issues. So these three scholars, they have laid the foundation, let's say, for this field of ELF. And initially, a lot of the publications that came from this research field were also going into the same direction as some of the World English Studies, that they were actually describing these different varieties of English that are spoken in lingua franca contexts. So there was also a so-called lingua franca core that the researchers came up with, which was a grammatical description of what are common features, let's say, of English lingua franca language, English lingua franca language that's being used. But so, as I've already said, like, one of the fundamental, let's say, problems has been that the field has been so far geopolitically extremely limited. So that has also landed them extensive criticism from all kinds of scholars who've called it either geopolitically or geoculturally limiting and focusing on the European context. But there's also, like, from my personal contribution, of one of the perhaps prime issues that I have taken with the field, and one only has to look at, for example, the Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca that was published in 2018. It's so this is it's a 600-page volume, with altogether 47 chapters, which obviously show the wealth of studies that are taking place within the field of English lingua franca. But there's not a single chapter that has given attention to the significance of race as a sociopolitical variable. And this is really obviously surprising, given that English lingua franca contexts are all over the world extremely racialized, and that the fact that this has not so far received any kind of attention was obviously also one of my great impetus for writing this book on South Africa, because, as most of you know, South Africa is in South Africa, race is in many contexts the absolute fault line when it comes to kind of socio-political power dynamics in the country. So I've in this book then I've aimed on engaging in an interdisciplinary perspective. So as I said, it's eclectic. It draws a lot from the ethnography, but it also does some discourse analysis of parliamentary speeches. It also draws from some more literary sources in order to really, let's say, show the wealth of how English lingua franca contexts impact on social power dynamics in the society. I've essentially also aimed to portray the struggles of ordinary South Africans, so to say, in diverse lingua franca contexts. And I have to mention that more recently, especially Jennifer Jenkins, and this is also from a personal conversation that I actually had with her, or communication correspondence that we had per email, is that, for instance, Jennifer Jenkins has very much acknowledged the fact that race has been a neglected variable, and that they are permanently now in the process of aiming to, let's say, incorporate it into future research projects. And that this, although staying within the European context, but considering already all kinds of, let's say, racialization dynamics. Okay. I think what I'll do is I'll go over to chapter 4, because this is the reading that I provided. And I'd like to, because this chapter focuses on marginalization and empowerment dynamics. And I want to read to you a small vignette, which this chapter starts with. It was in 2004, during my ethnographic research in the Umlazi township, that Bonkosi and I first met. He was teaching English and isiZulu, Bonkosi obviously a synonym. He was teaching English and isiZulu at a school called Nzibamandla High, in M section of the township. Bonkosi is a proud Zulu man who loves to use isiZulu idioms and proverbs, and took great joy in teaching me the language. Unlike most of his colleagues at Nzibamandla, he consciously decided to send his 8-year-old daughter to a nearby township school where he felt her isiZulu could be fostered. One of his colleagues at the time voiced great disapproval to me about this. She felt he wasn't doing what was best for his child, which in her view, of course, would have been to send his child to a so-called ex-Model C school outside of the township, where English was the only medium of instruction, also unofficially, and teachers were likely to be English mother tongue speakers. While Bonkosi spoke English with a strong African accent, he was fully proficient in the language. A few years later, in 2007, Bonkosi and I found ourselves flat hunting in Durban. And because we had a similar budget, but very different living preferences, we exchanged the number of agents several times. In numerous instances, Bonkosi told me that the agent said the flat was no longer available, despite him phoning immediately after I had viewed it. After this happened the third time, my suspicion grew. And to discount for a potential gender bias, I asked a male friend to phone. He was welcome to view the flat. Bongs was not. It was then that I realized that racism and racialization was at work through linguistic profiling. And it was clear Bonkosi was denied access to these flats in prime Durban suburbia on the basis of his accent, because his accent gave away his race. When we reflected on this injustice a few years later, Bonkosi mentioned that his daughter was no longer going to the township school. He laconically remarked, "Perhaps it isn't too late yet. She might still learn not to speak as Black as me." So I think in many ways, the vignette actually speaks for itself, but I chose to highlight it because it really shows the limits of empowerment through the use of English in certain contexts. And it also portrays the, let's say, systemic forces of marginalization to take place in a country like South Africa. Now, while Durban has, let's say, transformed tremendously at this point, the interviews that I collected primarily in the Cape area and I collected several, let's say, portraits of flat hunting experiences by African language speakers during that period. So which suggests that the housing market, perhaps not everywhere, but certainly in specific areas, is extremely racialized. So I think it's important to note that Bonkosi, while he was speaking English, he wasn't trying to speak isiZulu to the flat agent, but while he was speaking English, the act of speaking English still landed him in a sort of, in a marginalized, in a discriminated space, because the fault line here was once again race. But this chapter also does other things. So as I said, it's eclectic. It also moves across domains and contexts. So for instance, I also in this chapter portray how the defiance of English, the defiance of the lingua franca status of English can be used for empowerment in a specific political space. The discussion, for instance, takes place in relation to the rape trial of the then President Jacob Zuma. So he defied the lingua franca status of English in the rape trial in order to evoke cultural, linguistic, and extremely dangerous gender politics. He strategically at the time mobilized isiZulu as a cultural weapon to fight the English Eurocentric dominance of the court. And then, so this is another part of this chapter. And then towards the end, it still moves into another realm where I'm focusing on, let's say, a segment of the Afrikaner community who have embraced also a kind of marginalization rhetoric in relation to English by constructing what has been termed subaltern whiteness. So I know, like for many of you, this might already be a complete oxymoron. How can whiteness be subaltern? But this is precisely this discourse of some of the let's say Afrikaner alt-right, who focuses on English as the sole language of colonization and strongly draws on the argument that Afrikaans is an African language and that Afrikaans has been, or that Afrikaans speakers rather, have been suffering under the dominance of English speakers. So then I move on, chapter 5. I use the concept of linguistic mobility in order to relate it to something I call racial authenticity. And this is where I am, for instance, also analyzing discourse from parliamentary debates in South Africa, where you have African language speakers who speak English with various different kinds of accents. And it's in this chapter in particular where I also highlight how South Africa's stark socioeconomic disparities manifest, of course, on the one hand, continuously in white economic privilege, but also in a, let's say, in a more, let's say, uncomfortably positioned kind of Black middle class who's extremely reproachable, let's say, by other African language speakers who speak English due to their what is perceived or what has been termed as so-called white English. So Naledi Mpondo is, for instance, one of these examples. They're speakers by the Democratic Alliance who in particular have been, let's say, attacked and been called such names as coconuts or Musi Mayane, for instance, has been called as a Black man in a white man in black skin. Sorry, got it the wrong way around. So these type of dynamics are considered in chapter 5. I also highlight in that context how a concept by Veronelli, which is called the coloniality of language, is specifically relevant in that particular context. Because on the one hand, there are these very fixed perceptions about racial identities in relation to English language use. And on the other hand, there's also this incredible space for let's call it linguistic mobility that is provided for English speakers. But it also shows, this chapter in particular, in how, let's say, the socio-political and racial injustices of the past continue to simmer in the minds of South Africans. And this happens not just within, let's say, in terms of interracial relations, but also within the same ethnic groups or racial groups. In the next chapter, which I will speak only very briefly to, and I want to actually send a note to Busi here, who read this chapter actually before it went to production. I have to really express my sincere thanks to that. I don't think the chapter is nearly as edgy as Sinfri or Busi would want it in terms of let's say African feminist theories. I think I, in many ways, write this chapter in a way that is still locked in, let's say, the conventional binaries that a lot of gender studies in South Africa, or previous gender studies and language studies in particular, were located in. But what I aim to, let's say, discuss in that chapter is that there are various gendered, what I call gendered ambiguities in relation to isiZulu vis-a-vis English that are taking place, manifest themselves in the Zulu community. So I have tried to capture some of these lived realities of interviews that I've captured over this period of 8 years, sometimes in the context of other projects where English, or specifically English, was still ubiquitous, and where the talk was very often, when it came to the discussion of schooling in particular. Of course, the topic of language is always inextricably linked to the choice for one school rather than another school. So in this chapter, for instance, I describe how some of my female interviewees tended to have a stronger propensity to send their child to an ex-Model C or a so-called white school in order to provide precisely that what I mentioned in the vignette about what could be the best for the child's education, for the child's academic career, while in many cases fathers were quite adamant that for reasons other than language, such a school would not be a good choice. And so in many ways, this chapter also discusses let's say, a type of Zulu masculinity that is also linked to a strong pride of isiZulu and a strong pride and embracing of the mother tongue that is often, let's say, constructed in an extremely polarized manner, whereas English is perceived as something that contaminates or something that brings in negative influences, especially when it comes to the prospect of gender relations. Yeah. So that's chapter 7. In chapter 8, I go over to a bit more focusing on also identity struggles and politics of belonging. So specifically in that chapter, like I mentioned earlier on, I also draw from sources in novels, and I highlight, for instance, one specific author who has published now, I think, 3 pieces with the Mail and Guardian newspaper in 2020 mostly. Her name is Kollega Shange. She did a PhD at the University of Witwatersrand, and she made it a very conscious choice to write in a translingual, in a multivocal manner, in which she, for instance, she intersects her English writing, and this still in a, let's say, the traditional English only outlet that the Mailing Guardian is, yeah, where she brings in a lot of isiZulu, not just words, but entire sentences that are also not even put into italics, which is precisely one of her intentions as well, to make these languages intersect within one piece of writing, and also in order to perhaps make it clear that some of these isiZulu words simply do not translate into English, either very well or at all. And in these three pieces, for example, she also shows that she has this type of attitude that it's a little bit reminiscent of Steve Biko, you know, when he said, "I write what I like," but it's more not just, let's say, the content, but it's also the way that she writes, of course, that the way that she brings her story across. And in that way, in the interview, when I asked her whether she thinks that that her writing is accessible to most Mailing Guardian readers, she said that most certainly not. She had a very extensive positive feedback, and she's very grateful for having been able to publish with the Mailing Guardian nonetheless. And she basically, let's say, concluded by saying that if you don't understand my writing, I'm probably not writing for you. So I think this shows as well that there is, let's say, a strong move towards a type of English in South Africa that can be used, that is intersected extensively by other languages, which now could be interpreted in various different ways. Yeah, it can be seen perhaps as an impetus, or let's say as an appeal to South Africans, to especially monolingual South Africans, young South Africans who continuously, for instance, learn Afrikaans as a language, not an African language, and to take it as perhaps as a motivation as well to acquire African languages in order to really make more sense of these texts. In a way, I think Kollega Shange, I would see her as representative for a new generation of South African English speakers, writers, and artists who are now in the process of reclaiming their voice through innovative African English translingualism, and also by doing so very strongly demonstrating their linguistic citizenship that doesn't comprise only of English, but of course of all these other sources. And it's not just isiZulu, for instance, like she uses Tsotsitaal, she uses several forms of urban mixed language, which is intersected with youth language as well. Yeah, so it can be also questionable whether, for instance, some of her writing, as she writes it, is necessarily comprehensible to older isiZulu speakers. The chapter that then precedes the conclusion, and I don't want to speak very much about the conclusion, but I'm happy to send it to anyone who has an interest in the pre-publication PDF. But in the ninth chapter, I kind of in classic anthropological fashion, take the time to speak about positionality and reflexivity of the research. So that includes also very much a kind of critical engagement with my own persona in the field as a white German female with South African residency status, who feels intimately connected to the country, but might not always be perceived as such by others, right? So I speak in that chapter, I also write a lot about some of the feedback that I have received from consultants and from participants in interviews in response to my being in the field and interviewing. It also speaks more specifically as well to the Stellenbosch context, where the experience of this, let's say, the coloniality that is still very much tangible in that particular town has transpired via several experiences and encounters during the 6 months that I was there. It speaks, for instance, specifically as well to the festival that annually takes place, and how some of my interviewees, non-colored interviewees, have voiced either extremely controversial issues or blatant racism in respect of the fact that now, of course, the festival is open to all Afrikaans speakers. Yeah, but the problem is that there's the access, or let's say the welcoming of colored Afrikaans speakers, especially when it comes to modern music and DJs who are part of the Afrikaans movement, for instance, has not been taking place to the extent that, let's say, it should have. Yeah. So yeah, in this chapter then specifically, I also speak about how this kind of research that I've been doing, ethnography, is always replete with complex power relations, let's say, and how my own position as well in the field waxed and waned, and how it all was a learning process as well in acquiring, in collecting this data and acquiring the knowledge that I derived from the consultants and the participants in the field. In some ways, it also summarizes, let's say, the shortfalls and limitations of the whole book. And 40 minutes, so I think I'll come to an end. I think I'd perhaps just like to mention that in the conclusion, when writing the conclusion, I had just reread Ngugi's chapter, or Ngugi's book on moving the center, which is like a wonderful, I think most of you are familiar with it, wonderful collection of essays that really appeals to a pluralistic world order of languages, cultures, and peoples. And even though, of course, I'm working ultimately on English and its role within a multilingual South African society, and I'm not replacing, English with isiZulu as a lingua franca, ideally, which Ngugi would have probably suggested, having his own very consistent approach to let's say his own ideology. And I nonetheless hope he would forgive me. He's forgiving me for having borrowed his compelling sentence of moving the center for this conclusion, because what ultimately the book really does is that it moves the center of attention of English lingua franca research from this European and to some extent Asian context to Africa. Because ultimately a field, like a research field that reserves for itself this acronym of ELF, for this general phrase of English as a lingua franca. So it's really my conviction that if you reserve this acronym for yourself, then you can't close yourself to the realities of the rest of the world outside of the global north, let's say. So I think that this is the were one of the primary arguments that that African life worlds that have a distinct and very, very important role to play in the furthering and advancing of the field of English lingua franca. So even if this means that you have to shake some of your principles, that English is this relatively neutral language, which it isn't in the South African context, right? So so this point, that in Southernizing ELF, the focus on Africa is crucial, and also the African diaspora. And of course, with that, and linked to this again, the point that I raised in the beginning, that that English lingua franca communication all over the world is entangled in processes of racialization, racial positioning, and just racism, which requires attention, further attention in the field, also in order to dismantle the, let's say, the association of whiteness with English, to say. So I think I'll end it here and leave more time for questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Rudwick, for a brilliant presentation. I will now give over to Prof. Makoni for some conversation.
Okay, thanks a lot, Stephanie. This was quite helpful. I have a couple of comments and issues that I would like to raise. I want everybody who is listening, for example, to apply their minds to this scenario. A scenario in which you have the development of one of the major areas in linguistics or in applied linguistics called English as a lingua franca, which somehow can't see aspects about race until recent. Just imagine what type of scholarship that is, that you are able to expunge race from your analysis, but still you're making a claim about the linguistic, grammatical, and pragmatic aspects of the use of English globally. But issues about race are not there. The only way you can frame a discussion about English without taking into account race is if you are white. If you are not white, I don't see how you can see the extent to which aspects about race affect how your English is received or how your text is treated. But then the other interesting part about this, it's good that the English as the lingua franca people are now beginning to take into account seriously discussions about race. We were writing about race. I remember the book that edited in 2003 called Black Linguists on Language, Society, and Culture, 2 decades ago. But of course, they don't read things which are written by Black scholars. That's why they always end up in a blind alley, because they always read texts written by people like them, right? Whereas if you are not an American or European scholar, for you to survive, you need to read texts written by the other people, by them, and texts written, let's say, by African scholars and other people. In other words, the argument I'm making here is this: it is to the disadvantage of white scholarship to only read white scholarship, right? Because the problems that they're confronting now, that they're trying to address about race, have always been there. This reminds me of the point that Professor Ronke makes on language and gender, that some of the things that they're talking about, we knew all along. But because they don't read what we write, but they want us to read what we write, they always end up making the mistakes that they should have avoided. But anyway, that's beside the point. Then the other issue which is there is, I think, the point that Stephanie, you make quite well about whether you are studying English as lingua franca in South Africa or isiZulu as a lingua franca. I frankly don't see why at this stage in the development of South Africa, there should be any interest in a study of English. I think we have enough of that, right? The interesting argument, I think, are the ones that you were making about isiZulu as a multilingual language, as a multi-layered language, etc., etc. In other words, the way I think to think about it is like this. It is to say, what is it that research into English can learn from African languages research, not the other way around, not what is it that African language research can learn from English. It should be the other way around, because there's more to learn about the sociolinguistics of South Africa and Africa from discussions about African languages than from discussions about English. Right. What's your view on this first? And then we can continue.
Yes, Sinfri, I think it's an important point. I think it is. I think to a large degree, I agree with you that there is not a need to do any more studies on English if it's only English. But I guess and this, I guess, was also what I have been aiming on always, rather than focusing just on English, but focusing on the multilingual environment and drawing from isiZulu speakers and Afrikaans and Kaap speakers. And I think you're right. I think that there's much from African language research that should, let's say, inform in many ways the research on other languages, perhaps not only English, but I think to some extent it's taking place already. If we think about, and obviously I was in my COVID burnout on Friday, so I unfortunately missed Ellen's talk. But I think for instance, the example of youth language in Africa, I think in many ways shows this kind of synthesis of how African languages very much inform other urban forms of English that might still be, and to some extent, it's in some instances it's more English, perhaps in other instances it's more linked to an African language or a whole new way of speaking altogether. From perhaps one of my experiences, but this dates back very long ago, and I think this has also changed by now. I'm sure in many African language departments, I could imagine that this has changed. But when I started research on youth language in South Africa in 2003, 4, basically 5, I asked 2 colleagues from the isiZulu department. One of them was my teacher and the other one was the head of the department at the time. And I asked them if they would be interested in jumping on this project on isiXhosa, which was the language that learners in Mlazi told me is their language. This is what they speak, And there was absolutely, at the time at least there was absolutely no interest, unfortunately, because I think as language scholars, and this is not just African language scholars, but language scholars, as in teaching language scholars, not linguistic scholars, tend to, let's say, operate alongside this very normative way of studying language, from correctness to incorrectness, right? So there isn't so much this argument that our scholars formulated, that, or world English scholars rather formulated, that Englishes in the world are all varieties in their own right. They are rule governed, and that they are let's say that they are just different. They're not they're not inferior in any ways. And I think that unfortunately at the time there was the sense that this language, this Isitsotsi, was certainly not worthwhile any study, because it doesn't reflect the isiZulu as it should be spoken. So I was explained that this was a severely contaminated form, and to make a study out of this is ludicrous. But I think this is not. This might also be very specific. The context. I think it also has changed to a large degree. I think there's also, when it comes to, for instance, radio channels in South Africa now, perhaps apart from Ukhosi FM, but certainly the, let's say, younger radio channels, there's an incredible amount of African language usage that informs the English language, let's say. And I think to get back to your point, I think this is in many ways also Kollega Shange's argument that English as it is now, as it is considered English in South Africa now, has to move out of this realm of purism, and it has to welcome, it has to be embracing change. It has to a larger degree, bring in the influence of African languages and also Afrikaans, I guess.
I agree with you. What is interesting there philosophically, I think, is that the linguists, I think, find it easier to frame and talk about English as a hermetically sealed unit, detach it completely from its various contexts. Because let's say in the South African case, they might not be very familiar with the dynamic context in which English is simply one amongst the many other different languages that are being used. So because you don't know the context in which English is being used simply as part of a broader repertoire, what you then tend to do, you compensate for your lack of social knowledge of context by creating a fictional category called English that is completely detached from other languages. So you have English linguistics, English phonology, and all that. Because you don't know, for example, how English is used in isiZulu, in KwaZulu-Natal as part of a broader range. So in other words, what I'm arguing now, for example, is that in terms of Southern approaches to language, what has really happened is that the social inabilities of the linguists have been translated into methodologies. Because we don't know how to handle the context in which these languages are used, we have to create particular objects that we can handle. And this is interesting because, for example, you cite the example of, I can't remember the name of this, the young guy who writes in a mix of different languages. It is quite likely that his scholarship, his literature, doesn't occur frequently in the, let's say, in English literature, because the professors of English don't know how to read such texts. So they then have to create a canon of English that they can control. In other words, our methodologies reflect our own social weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, then let me ask the last question, then we can open up for everybody. You were talking about issues about race. What do you understand by whiteness, Stefan? In South Africa or elsewhere? I know we are working on a handbook on this. What does whiteness mean for you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Cynthia. I'm glad you asked me this because it really pushes me as well to. So I thought about this when I was writing this chapter 9 on positionality as well. So certainly, for instance, I think whiteness is different in South Africa if it's a European whiteness and if it's a South African whiteness, for instance.
Okay.
So, but that doesn't mean that it's less less privileged or
Yes.
less problematic, perhaps to say. But what it does mean is that certainly, I think in some of my research contexts, it came to my advantage that I was not South African white, and also firstly that I was not South African white, and that I was not speaking English as a mother tongue. That's obviously. So, but at the same time, I think this is something that that's something that I write about in this chapter, is the fact that when I was starting as a junior lecturer at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I was dumped this massive course, which was called Academic Learning in English, and it had huge student numbers at the time. I think at its first, it was some 500 students, and I was supposed to coordinate it. And I had 10 tutors under myself, and I was far too young to really to do this very well, to do the coordination of this course very well. Several of our tutors were African language speakers, but primarily they were just English mother tongue speakers. And I made the mistake, for instance, to think that that my own background as someone who acquired English relatively late in life, let's say, you know, I started in grade 5 with my English lessons, and that to suggest to the students, to suggest to my isiZulu speaking students from extremely different backgrounds that I was, that they could learn English just as well as I do. Yeah, ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, ridiculous from so many perspectives. Yeah, and I think this is also where the point of ELF also comes in, because they afford in their journal, they have a disclaimer in their author's guidelines, which I think I spoke to you about this simply before, but basically it states that they don't, I mean, consistent with their ideology, they accept papers that are not necessarily written in conventional standard English, but as long as they are accessible to a broad English-speaking audience, something along these lines. Don't quote me directly on it, but something along these lines. And, you know, the journal can afford this because the overwhelming majority of authors who publish in these journals are actually from the global north. And even though, yes, they are European Englishes and Asian Englishes, that English is still pretty close to the standard. Yeah. So for instance, for my own journal, I edit a journal which is called Modern Africa. It's an outlet that we have in African studies at the University of Hradec, Králové. It's now on Scopus, but it's a small scale kind of underdog journal. And we publish mostly African scholars. And quite frankly, I can't afford such a disclaimer in my author's guidelines, because if I have articles that are submitted to us in Pidgin English, I can be sure that our journal will fly off the Scopus list, right? So I think it's also that point, I think, that needs to be made, that English in Europe is far more easily accessible, or whatever, also the kind of English, what is considered to be a global standard of good English, yeah, is obviously, in terms of its accessibility, is completely different in Africa than in Europe. And I think that's, yeah, so should I go back to whiteness now? Should I say something else about the whiteness? Yeah, I'll be happy to send the chapter as well to people. But there is, for instance, I describe as well how I catch myself out on not considering the whiteness of my being, of my existence, in some situations that I encountered during the research. It also describes how I think it was a very long learning curve for me to acknowledge that there is something really negative about this kind of benevolent behavior, that if someone means well, it's still not good to mean well. That I think that there, maybe to be more concrete here, to give you a specific example of where in a conversation with one of the consultants who at the time was working on her own research project, actually. And I was suggesting to her that I could proofread, or I was implying in many ways that I could improve her proposal that was written though it was on basket weaving among Zulu women. Yeah. And then, yeah, so how dare me to suggest that that would necessarily bring in any benefit. But obviously I meant well in, correcting it to standard English. But I mean, the point is, I guess, that the academy is not ready for this. I mean, Jürgen Jaspers has this excellent comment in one of his papers where he says that when it comes to translanguaging, we should catch ourselves on our own, let's say, hypocrisy, because we are, as scholars, we are the first one to sigh if, teachers in high schools don't embrace translanguaging and, the wide embracing of all linguistic sources that are available in the classroom. But we are very, very far from any readiness to transform our own linguistic behavior or our own journals and our own academic writing into more translingual forms, right? So I think it is an important point to remember as well.
Are you unmuted, Prof?
Are you saying this, Stephanie, that in South Africa, if you are a white foreign woman, you are treated differently from local South African whites?
I would say that, yes.
You would say that,
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in what way is them, are you more privileged if you are white foreign in South Africa than if you are just locally white South African?
Well, I think I think it's extremely complex. But
Is it okay?
From I mean, certainly one point that that was the response that I received from learners, in particular, from African learners, is that considering that, and I'm not sure how it had been if I was English, if I was British,
yes,
out of the colonization, but certainly for me as a German white person, there was a sense of, let's say, there was perhaps an extent of interest in my background that many learners didn't have any idea about, and wanted to learn more, wanted to hear more about what Germany was about, or where I came from was about. And I would also argue that the fact that I wasn't born during apartheid, and the fact that I didn't grow up as a white privileged South African, and in some way could detach myself, through my Europeanness, I could detach myself from this dirty baggage. I think it did help the research process. Yeah.
I think that's very interesting to write about the different whitenesses within South Africa, and I think it applies across the board. The question that is there is whether there are different blacknesses. Yeah, but that's another story.
Well, just on this note, still, maybe just very quickly, Sinfri, on certainly, it was interesting for me to also see how Afrikaners very often reacted to me, because of course there's this underlying, sometimes this underlying sense of solidarity in your Germanic roots, which then can land you in really awkward, uncomfortable situation where you have to listen to some racist rant. But also what happens is that they then, if as soon as you also go into any kind of oppositional stance, then you have very quickly, what happened to me with many different Afrikaners is that I don't understand that because I'm European. So they are African, you know, Afrikaners would make their claim to their Africanness, despite their whiteness, of course, but and that basically makes me the very obvious other who can't really relate to any context properly in South Africa, because I'm missing that sense of that being part of the African soil in a real sense. Yeah. So I think that's also the complexity of whiteness in many ways. And there are, yeah, I think that there are different whitenesses. I would say that there are different blacknesses.
Okay, let me hand over to Chanel. I know that Christine wanted to talk about whitenesses and race in Brazil, but do you want to jump in, Christine?
Yes, briefly. I was just wondering about the languages in diaspora, because we generally talk about from the perspective of English as a word language, as a lingua franca. But for example, in whole Latin America, English does not make much sense in people's life, everyday life. Maybe Ashraf can say something about the Arabic word. So sometimes we talk about colonization, but then we talk from the perspective of British colonization. And sometimes we just erase that there were other types of colonization and practices of resistance. So I was just wondering about this. What's the role, for example, of Portuguese and Spanish in all this discussion? When you talk about English as a lingua franca or English as a foreign language and so on. So, and also I was thinking about the languages of diaspora, the African heritage in diaspora. Brazil is the biggest, the most Africans during colonial era were brought to Brazil. So if you compare, like, for about 400,000 to the United States against 5 million to Brazil. Even the whole Latin America, Brazil is the biggest, African country outside Africa. And we just wonder, so how in Brazil is it possible to define, to talk about a linguistic and discursive heritage from Africa in terms of language and so on? Like, for example, in the United States, you talk about Afro-vernacular English, African vernacular English. It's so clear, all this discussion with Labov, starting this discussion in the 60s and 70s until today. But in Brazil, there is no something called as African Brazilian Portuguese. What there is here is Brazilian Portuguese. So Brazilian Portuguese was this big invention since 19th century when Brazil became independent. During the whole 20th century, a big invention of linguistics, of course, and of all these elites, the white elite, that created this idea of a Brazilian Portuguese as different from Portuguese, from European Portuguese. Then you have all this resistance there. Oh, there is something called Brazilian Portuguese. So it's different from the colonizer, the Portuguese. We don't speak an European language, we speak a Brazilian language. So there is all this discussion of, there is something there in terms of the coloniality of language. But that sometimes, by talking about this idea of Brazilian language, there is all this invisibility of African heritage, even because we don't know how to, even linguistics has its limits to define what counts as African languages and African heritage. Like, for example, descriptive linguistics does not help at all in terms of what counts as African heritage. So all this discussion about creolizing language, Creole language, so is just does not help if we really want to recognize what it means Africanness or African languages in the diaspora. So I was just bringing these points and how complex complex is all this history of colonization and the practice of resistance.
Mm. Mm.
Thanks, Marconi. Thanks, Stephanie. I really appreciated the discussion and your book and your text.
Thanks a lot. I think you make a very good point that there are different types of colonizations, and that any robust discussion of colonization has to be comparative. British colonization may have been different from French colonization, from Portuguese colonization. I think that's a point well made. And the other point that you make is where you talk about the limits of a discipline, that we have to be sensitive of the fact that disciplines have their limits. Descriptive linguistics, like you're saying, doesn't know in Brazil how to handle issues about African heritage and all that. And if you think about it for a second, how bizarre that is, that outside Africa, the majority of people of African heritage are in Brazil. But the descriptive linguistics and descriptive apparatus within Brazil, which linguistics has inherited from, which theoretical linguistics has inherited, can't handle the majority phenomenon. Just think about it for a second. It can't handle the language experiences of the majority of the individuals that it deals with. And Chanel, back.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's go to the first question by Sibosiso. Very few to none of the students seem to learn standard written monolingual English, in quotation marks, but most of them do command some degree of proficiency that is context and modal based and flexible, such as the multilingual and multisemiotic repertoires on WhatsApp or on media. If this is what students are finding more relevant in society, academics are not making a huge difference to research on English. What should be the implication for the translingual and multivocal use of language that you described, referring to chapter 8 particularly?
Well, I guess one of the implications should be research on precisely that actually academics, and I think that has been starting to take place to a large extent. I know Anna Deumert has published quite extensively already on this kind of media language on media discourse, and I guess within the context of youth languages, but perhaps, yes, I mean, specifically to English, I think it would be relevant to engage in further research that really examines precisely how these multisemiotic repertoires are unfolding in everyday usage of South African urbanites primarily, I guess. So, I mean, the implication more, let's say, more broadly, I would not necessarily make an argument for the re-standardization of English in South Africa at this point. I think that the South African English Dictionary already includes a wealth of African language terms, of course, in Afrikaans terms. I think I would go as far, I would dare to make that argument in relation to Afrikaans, that Afrikaans is in need of some sort of re-standardization, given that it's also the majority of mother tongue Afrikaans speakers who speak something that is different from the so-called standard Afrikaans. So I think that's probably not the case in terms of English, because English is only spoken by less than 10% of the South African population as a first language. I'm not so sure I responded well to your question, but I think, as you say, that academics are not making a huge difference to research in English, I think we should. That would be my comment. I think that this is definitely still a field that is worthwhile of further studies.
Thank you so much. Then Tiza has a comment. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Rudwick. I really enjoyed it. I would like to ask for pre-publication of your chapter on positionality and study limitations. If I'm not mistaken, this is the chapter you said precedes the conclusion. Okay. So he said it will really help him in his own work. Yeah, so at the moment we don't have any other questions. So I will throw it back to Prof. Makoni.
I want to bring, I want to have a conversation with you, Stephanie, but I want to put Cliff on the spot. Cliff, when you talk about non-standard language proficiency, what exactly do you mean? In your studies, for example, when you're talking about the non-standard language proficiency, what do you mean by that?
Okay, what I'm referring to is the use of language, non-academic, yes, I mean non-academic.
Non-academic.
But in the sense that if it's students interacting amongst themselves,
yes,
in different online platforms, then they do that easily. And they do use varieties of English as well. I mean, all these various languages, not even varieties of English, but various means of communication, basically, which is not even taught or policed by anyone. So that's what I wanted to mean. I meant by that.
So you are saying that when they are in these platforms, they are able to use language much more flexibly.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So then flexibility would be one key indicator of proficiency in non-academic. They will be using language non-academically, but to discuss academic topics.
Yes.
Oh, okay. But this is it both written or spoken?
It's both. I would say both spoken and written.
Okay. Oh, I see. So this is interesting. Was the question that I wanted to ask. I wonder whether Unyere is still around. Is Unyere still around here? Because I wanted to ask her, or she's gone. I wanted to discuss with her the implications of this for the Nigerian context. Ashraf, what's your view on this?
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, yeah, do jump in.
Yeah, I've also noticed that the ownership of English is quite interesting in South Africa, because white South African students obviously think they own English better than me, even if I teach them. and an Indian colleague also thinks they know more English, even if they've not studied anything much in applied linguistics. And so I think if you're thinking about then the English as a lingua franca in South Africa, what kind of directions would actually reach to this kind of ownership? Because again, blacks as well, they've got their own, like you said in the case of Bongos, I'm sure he was also suffering, or his child as well is also a victim of this ownership of English as well, which then people meet much later in life or when they are looking at other opportunities.
Yeah, I think that certainly, I think in South Africa, there has to be a shift towards acknowledging that second language speakers of English are just as proficient as first language speakers, and sometimes more proficient simply. Yeah, but I guess how to precisely go about that in terms of execution, I think this is, I mean, ideally this should be, part of every English academic literacy course that students take at university. So certainly colleagues, we shouldn't, well, let's say you shouldn't be hearing this from colleagues. I think that there's certainly, let's say, some negative bias in public discourse. I think this is also why in South Africa, I find it again and again amazing how people who speak precisely with this very immaculate English standard accent, but who might already be as well first language speakers primarily, but not, let's say, have multi-ethnic backgrounds, that they are clearly finding employment to a large extent in the public, when it comes to media and television, radio, apart from the African language channels, let's say, especially when it comes to news still and kind of reporting and discussion fora. I think that's that I always find again and again puzzling, that there are actually, that from my perspective, there's simply not enough exposure of African language speakers, African accented English that one finds, especially in these kind of more prestigious news channel outlets. And I think that also feeds a general attitude that this is the kind of English that is obviously the desirable, and that is the ideal and the norm. Well, it's not, and of course it's not the norm, but I think in many, this is different when it comes to parliament. And this is interesting because in many ways parliament can also, I think, in that way inspire more general public discourse. Not that it's all inspiring what's being talked about in the parliament at all, but for instance, I find it always reviving as well, and incredible how consistently the one lady you might know, no, I can't think of her name. Now I can't think. It's an EFF parliamentarian. She's been consistently, for instance, asking for translation services into isiZulu, and she has been consistently only speaking isiZulu in her own speeches in parliament. So I think that there is also quite a lot of, let's say, disruption of this generally acknowledged English lingua franca status of English parliament. It's been taking place on several platforms. And as well, the fact that in the chapter 6 that I analyze, for instance, how people who speak with this particular white standard English accent are often also attacked, so how you have this kind of reverse dynamic which claims that in order to be a proud African, you should not be speaking like a white person, right? I mean, this is this implicit, let's say, the implicit background to that kind of dynamic. But as I said, I think in general, the fact that in the prestigious media outlets, there still isn't enough exposures of different accented, different, let's say, varieties of Englishes that are spoken, that obviously doesn't help the general public opinion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Rudwick. Kim?
Yeah, mine's more of a comment, or I don't know if there's a question here, but when you're thinking about the implications of all of this kind of within South Africa, I want to encourage everybody else to think about South Africa's position in the region as well. My work and travel experiences have brought me to Angola and Mozambique, so close to South Africa, and it's really interesting because I'm, white, English is my first language, American, and I went there through US government programs to teach English. And I would get to these places and be like, wait, there's all these countries that border these places who I'm sure have plenty of speakers to come and teach English. Why am I here? And it kind of obviously answers some other questions that we've been bringing up about whiteness and which English we prefer. But just thinking about South Africa, in my experience, it's been kind of like the point of reference for maybe trade and kind of other things. But then when we think about language, it seems like the point of reference for a lot of places, and obviously there's more involved. Like I said, I went with the US government. It's like shifted, and we can't let South Africa be this place of like the center for language either, at least English language, even though it de facto is. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but that's kind of my experience.
Can I come in, please? For some reason, I can't find where to raise the hand icon, so I just interfere. Thank you so much for the presentation, Stephanie. Very interesting. I was when actually Christine was speaking about, how Brazil is the biggest African country outside Africa. That actually raised a question in my mind about what counts as white. And I think Sinfrey once said that we need to think about whiteness as a frame of power, and not in terms of biology. The usefulness of this conception is that in countries, in contexts like Sudan, for example, the white color is green. The white color, the color of power, is green. And there's a paper by Francis Denk, and I mentioned this paper before. It's called "Green is the Color of the Master." Green is the color of the master. So in Sudan, for example, the color of power is not white, it's green in that sense. And race is involved in Sudan as many countries. And we had a genocide. Genocide means the main reason for killing, it's not the main reason, of course, it's a proxy, but it's race. So in that sense, we can say, we can disengage ourselves from defining color in terms of biology. Because in my view, we always say that, race is a social construction, or scarce construction, color are the same thing. But again, we use still biology as a reference in the background. It's my experience. So we can have a white color, which is non-white, in the sense that a color of power. And I gave the example of Sudan. And also, when we were talking about the working a presentation, it's very interesting. But some of the vocabulary, like accent, first language, foreign language, and so on, is still the same traditional vocabulary of monoglossia. It's still the traditional vocabulary. A race is there. Again, it's involved in that vocabulary. Somehow, accent, again, leads us back to the white man, as you said, rightly, Stephanie, the white standard, British, and so on. So the question is, how can we liberate ourselves from this vocabulary? Can we talk about English as lingua franca outside this vocabulary, using a different vocabulary? Can we stop talking about accent? Or at least can we redefine, reformulate the conception of accent, and so on. And the last point, yes, and again, the last point is about writing. In speaking, the native speaker, as we normally understand it, the native speaker controls the language. But when it comes to writing, it's us who control that register. I can invent a terminology in writing. You have written a book, Stephanie, and you might have created some terminologies in that register, in that English as a lingua franca for us. But in spoken language, you do not control that register somehow. You cannot invent a term in the spoken everyday English. If it's seen from the perspective of a whole language. So, and again, it's my opinion that the idea of wholeness is also there. So accent, second language, first language, foreign language, wholeness. So again, I think we need to liberate ourselves from that vocabulary and to see how we can talk about English as a lingua franca from a different discourse, from a different universe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashraf. I've avoided, to be honest, I have avoided in the book to use accents. I mean, sometimes I employ it anyway, but I think I've used ways of speaking in many different ways. I went back to kind of Heim's old saying about ways of speaking. So different ways of speaking English, for example, that I use extensively in the book because it seemed to, I think it just seems to be less negatively connotated or less stuck within the kind of global north conceptualization of language. And what you said last now, I had a thought that I've now forgotten. What was the last point you made, Ashraf, just now?
The control of defining language in terms of registers and thinking, also focusing on the writing, and that in that sense we have the power over writing. On writing, we overpower the native speaker in the normal sense. When it comes to writing, we can invent, as I said, terminologies. We can invent even theories in words and so on. We better control. We are in better position when it comes to writing. In the context of English as a lingua franca.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there's I also quote in the book from a poet who translates, for instance, concepts out of African languages into her English poem. And by doing so, she makes the argument that she wants to be among the people or within the people. It's like for her literally translated in a sense from African languages. And she, even though she knows that a proofreader, probably English mother tongue speaking, would correct her on this, she insists on using this different proposition because it simply makes sense in the context of this African life world. And because of this, she consciously chooses to and insists on employing that position, that proposition, which I guess is from a general standard language perspective, the incorrect one. But in order to really appeal and translate it to her African language readers, she insists on this. And perhaps also a second related point still is that the way that Kollega as well, I think how she interpreted, let's say, her own choices is as well to really transform or make English or make African culture translatable into the English language. It only leaves her with the choice of maintaining certain African terms because of I think I mentioned earlier, and because she simply deems it entirely untranslatable. So I think I had something else that I wanted to say, but blame it on COVID. My brain is not quite functional yet.
Thanks so much, Ashraf. So I just have a question on, earlier you were talking about whitenesses and blacknesses. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about so-called colored people. I'm not comfortable using the word colored, but sometimes so-called colored people are thrown into this not white enough, not black enough. So I'm not even sure if I'm talking about whitenesses or blacknesses when I'm talking about this particular topic. But because this particular group of people speak Afrikaans, how does that then position them in this hierarchy that you are, or what you are referring to in terms of how the space fits around certain bodies or not, to use Bolton Ahmed? What is your experiences of particularly Black Afrikaans speakers? Or what have you found out about these particular group of people in South Africa? Yeah.
So yes, I have 2 chapters that that consider colored Afrikaans speakers, and there's, on the one hand, there's this argument that English, as in other African language speaking communities, is still is, let's say, restricted in terms of access, and also is put on this pedestal. So, for example, the type of, let's say, exclusionary or exclusion-inclusion dynamics that take place in African language speaking communities, they also take place in colored speaking, in colored Afrikaans speaking communities, in a sense where, for example, someone who speaks with this immaculate English immediately is being put on the stamp as someone who's, whatever is associated with this privileged schooling, or someone who is perhaps considered more white than someone else. And for instance, one of the interviews that I did that really I found extremely interesting is that that this interview made a point that she said that you can get away with speaking English, standard English or immaculate English very well, yeah. But if you speak, but you don't want your child to speak standard Afrikaans as a colored person. So I thought that was a very interesting dynamic as well, that there's a strong, especially in the Western Cape, I'm sure you're familiar with the Afrikaans movement. And in fact, I also have in chapter 8, I think it is, I copied the entire Kaap's poem, rap, right? Because I think in many ways, are you familiar with that? That R.I.V. Kaap's by, I must send it to you. So it's a rap poem by this brand, or it was linked to a DJ who basically came up with the poem and the rap. It's quite dramatized. So it starts with saying that Afrikaans is just the same as Afrikaans, that Kaaps is as valuable, and it juxtaposes in the poem, in fact, some of the Kaaps terms with standard Afrikaans terms, in order to acknowledge that this is just the same, and that in the message of the poem in many ways is that we're no longer going to be told that this is an inferior way of speaking, that this is our way of speaking and this is just as valuable. But interestingly, the poem is in English. Yeah. So it's an English poem. And when discussing this, for instance, with various participants of the research, colored participants, many of them felt that, it's extremely emotional. In fact, I write in the book that really the poem brought tears to one of the interviewees in Manneberg, and I think people who were not familiar with the poem, they found it extremely they linked, they could really relate very well to the poem. But at the same time, I also various times received the comment that because it's in English, it cannot be as strong a statement for Kaaps as it should be, because the poem should be in Kaaps after all. Yeah. So, and because English is not equally accessible to the entire colored community, there's, you know this much better than I do, but certainly from my travels throughout the country, there were areas where I didn't get anywhere with English, where, Grafrenet and areas where you simply speak Afrikaans, or otherwise you won't be able to make yourself very well understood.
Just one last question. In terms of self-identification, did many of the participants think of themselves as colored or Black?
So I had some participants who preferred the term brown, and others that, and then this varied. Yeah, this varied between colored and Black. Some people clearly said that I'm not Black, I'm colored, but there were a couple of young students that I also interviewed in 2015-16, and they were part of the Open Stellenbosch movement, for example. So they, understandably as well, through that context, they very strongly identified as Black. So I think that, yeah, no.
Interesting. Thanks, Dr. Rudwick. Many more questions, but I'll just email you. Okay, Adrian has a question. I'm glad you talked about the reverse dynamic when it comes to the performance of Africans in European languages. This is what I call the psychopathological experience of many African researchers. I saw the struggle with Wole Soyinka and Leslie Chinua Achebe. My question to you is, how do you define this difficult African situation, which has been so serious among French-speaking Africans, also since the time of Senghor and Césaire?
To be honest, really, I think I'm not even in a position, I'm not in a place, Adrian, to evaluate that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think this has been, since the Négritude movement, I think has always been very much at the forefront of these, identity politics, I guess, that many African researchers, especially from French-speaking African countries as well, find themselves in. But please forgive me. I think I'm not. I don't feel positioned to in my white German background. I feel like you're a much better place to evaluate that, to define this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rudwick. I will now give over to Prof. Makoni for final comments.
Yes, I think I saw Busi raising her hand. Oh, she's gone. Okay.
No, I didn't.
Sorry, Busi. I didn't see.
No, I didn't raise my hand at all.
Oh, okay. Now the question is this: what did we learn?
Anything.
Yeah, we did learn a lot. I think the comments by Kim and then Ashraf and Christine forced us to learn one thing. If you want to learn a lot about South Africa, you need to learn about the nature of the language dynamics and politics in other contexts. That I think we have now passed the stage where research into South Africa is only on South Africa. For example, the work that Cliff does work on Ethiopia, Kenya, and all that enriches his understanding of South Africa. Kim made a very interesting point that what about language use in the neighboring countries, etc., etc. That it's a conceptual mistake to think of South Africa as cut off from the impact of the neighboring countries and the other global movements. If you do that, you will only see the internal dynamics within South Africa and not see how they play themselves out different. Ashraf's discussion of whiteness, for example, just illustrated completely the need to talk about whiteness in the following sense, that whiteness in a South African context might mean this, but that may be very different in another context. And the examples about whiteness being green in Sudan, I think are straight to the point, because they capture very effectively the need to adopt a comparative approach to the context that we're dealing with. Christine's argument about understanding how the different colonialities differ is useful to keep bearing in mind as we talk about colonization, etc. That colonization may have played itself very differently in different parts of the world. In other words, we can't. We are past the Robben Island stage of scholarship, in which you only know one context. That Robben Island stage of scholarship is gone now. You can't survive this context. You need to be able to know what's happening in another context. I may be interested in Zimbabwe, but the only best way of understanding Zimbabwe is if I'm able to compare it with other contexts. So, for example, if you're talking about youth varieties across the world, etc., you need somehow, you can't avoid addressing or studying the African American vernacular studies and all that to get to know what they've been talking about. But somehow these two areas are kept completely artificially apart. You will learn much more about what you're trying to do in Africa if you spend some time reading about the work by the Black American scholars and linguists, Arthur Spears, John Bowie, etc. They will give you a much better insight into your own context. In other words, the way to proceed now is to put a pause on those contexts that you like working in and start reading about other contexts. That really does help you to understand even the context that you like. If, for example, I was interested in studying the Western Cape, the way to go about studying the Western Cape at the moment is not to proceed and carry out more research in the Western Cape, but to see how issues about race, coloredness play themselves out in West Africa, in the United States, etc., and then come back to the Western Cape. So, in other words, digging yourself deeper and deeper in your own small context won't take you anywhere. Then the other thing that I think we learned was that methodologically, in some cases, the tools are just not there to capture the complexities of the situation. And that's what I think Christine managed to say very effectively, that Brazilian sociolinguists are not able to describe the majority of language varieties that they see in front of them. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I know. I just want to thank you for that, for making the point that I think we also, as I've moved more from a language studies field now towards African studies, and I realized this shortfall of focusing on only one country. Yes, I think that a more Pan-African perspective really is necessary.
It helps a lot. You remember the conversation that you, me, and Unyere had when we were talking about, we were writing a paper together and we were debating all that. I mean, those things do help a lot by learning other contexts, right? Because that is the only way you will get to understand even the context that you may like best, by reading and writing and working in other contexts. If you dig yourself deeper and deeper within one context, it won't take you anywhere, right? It won't take you anywhere. Like we were talking about whiteness or blackness, for example. Yes, South Africa, you can do an immaculate study of coloredness, but you need to come out of South Africa and see how does it play itself, let's say, in the Sudan. If I ask the same question in the Sudan, what do I come up with? Right. Once you've done that, you can see, then you get to understand what Ashraf is saying. Then you can go back even to the South African context. But now, analytically, you've got a much richer analytical base of how to handle this. For example, what Adrian was talking about, the Francophone dimension to these discussions. what do discussions about native speakerhood in Francophone Africa among French scholars like your supervisor, Nkonko Kamanga Malu and company, how do they respond to that? Right. So another dimension to it is this, is that we have tended to read Anglophone scholarship. We haven't read a lot in terms of Francophone or Arabic scholarship. For me, the advantage about, I get to know more about Arabic scholarship through Ashraf. Unfortunately, I don't read Francophone scholarship. So there's a big gap in my own thinking about sociolinguistics, because I don't know what the debates are within written within French, right? Because I don't know, for example, whether at the moment there's any discussions about translanguaging movement within French linguistics, or this is just an idiosyncratic phenomenon arising from Euro-America. I've got no clue. But if we're going to be a global forum, we need to read a scholarship in different languages. Christine's advantage is that she reads Portuguese. So she can come up and say, oh, but this doesn't work in Portuguese sociolinguistics, it is different. So the other thing that is there is we have to learn to read the scholarship in different languages, or work with scholars who are able to read the sociolinguistics in other languages. For example, they may read Portuguese, they may read Arabic, they may read French. In your conversation with those individuals, epistemologically, you are much more enriched, because your blind spots become clearer when you listen to somebody who reads not only English scholarship, but scholarship in other languages. Okay.
I think you've responded. One last thing, I think you responded in some ways to your own question from earlier, you know, when you asked, are there different kinds of Blackness? And yes. I think, I mean, in some sense now, the way you spoke, I think you really, to some extent, responded to that question. And I just also now thought about the issue of xenophobic violence, for instance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I guess yes. South Africa, but other times, but there are certainly, I think we do have some tentative answers to that, yeah, but not enough research. I think this is
that's true. That's true. Vishna, you have been very quiet. What's your view about this? I'm putting you on the spot. I said you've been very quiet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in this area at all. So mostly I'm just trying to soak it in and learn as much as I can.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, guys.
Thanks to all of you.
Thanks to all of us. So we meet next week. Kim, you want to make the announcement?
Yes, so the next session will be next Friday, January 28th at 9 a.m. US Eastern time, so our regular time. And we'll hear from David Bade, who'll be talking about living theory and theory that kills, language, communication, and control. So thanks again for a wonderful session, and we hope you can join us next week.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. You must come and attend next week's session, because David Bade is the only person I know in the world who is both a librarian and a farmer and a linguist. So you'll be able to talk about how his world revolves around those three items, how talking to horses and dealing with books and doing linguistic analysis, how that has shaped his understanding of communication. He's an amazing guy. Yeah. Okay, then. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.